The quest for a diplomatic solution in the face of an otherwise terrifying prospect of war on the European continent. Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin have agreed in principle to a summit-level meeting that could happen as early as this week. But can Putin get the buffer that he wants between Russia and NATO? Or will the threat of US sanctions push him further into a corner, forcing him to retaliate? I'm Jafar Hasnan, and today's newsmaker is the proposed summit between Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin. The signs are encouraging from both Moscow and Washington. Russia put up an impressive display of its strategic nuclear capabilities over the weekend. The signaling was impossible to miss by power centers in Europe and America. The US, for its part, has said that the door has been left open for diplomacy.
So is diplomacy off the table then?
No, until he does, diplomacy is always a possibility.
Russia has repeatedly underlined its right to strategic self-defense against increasing NATO presence on its borders. The Kremlin has stood by its demand that NATO roll back its troop deployments from former Soviet states. It has also demanded a guarantee of no further NATO expansion in the future. Any summit aimed at a diplomatic solution would be through this lens.
A meeting between Vladimir Putin and Joe Biden is possible if it's deemed beneficial by the heads of state. Right now, there's a clear, concrete understanding about the need to continue the dialogue at the foreign ministers' level.
We welcome this initiative. We believe that every effort aimed at diplomatic solution is worth trying. Secretary Blinken assured me that, as it has been the case until now, no decisions about Ukraine will be taken behind Ukraine's back, and we will closely coordinate with him on the eve of, as they will be preparing this summit, to synchronize our positions and to make sure that our interests will be taken into account.
There is not much support on the European continent for war with Russia. European powers, such as Germany and France, are keen on protecting economic growth and transitioning to a clean energy economy. The threat of US sanctions, on the other hand, could very easily worsen the situation. President Putin would find himself forced into a tighter corner and would feel the need to lash out with stronger action on the Ukrainian border. Let's not forget that Russia and China are witnessing a historic in relations. US sanctions would only serve to cement ties between Beijing and Moscow, forcing them into an axis of power that would seek to undermine US global influence and interests. Now, generally speaking, all sides agree that the implementation of the 2015 Minsk agreement is the best hope for peace. The problem, however, lies in the profound differences between Moscow and Kiev in the interpretation of the agreement.
The settling is still stalled. Our consultations with partners on this issue don't help, despite all our efforts and contacts. On the level of counselors and leaders of the countries of the Normandy format, Kiev doesn't comply with the Minsk agreements, refuses to establish a direct dialogue with Donetsk and Luhansk, undermines the agreements to introduce changes in the constitution, the exclusive statute of Donbass, local elections, and the amnesty, all key issues of the Minsk agreements.
And so, let's take a look at some key points of the Minsk agreement that will continue to hold center stage in any diplomatic effort aimed at resolving the Russia-Ukraine standoff. First up is the withdrawal of foreign armed formation, military equipment, and mercenaries by Ukraine and Russia from Donetsk and Luhansk. This, together with constitutional reform in Ukraine that would promote decentralization to empower the people of Donetsk and Luhansk. Granting of special status to the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk by the Ukrainian parliament. accompanied by discussions on interim self-governance for Donetsk and Luhansk in step with the constitutional reform in Ukraine. And finally, full-fledged elections in the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. And joining me now from Istanbul is Matthew Bryza. He's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center and a former U.S. ambassador to Azerbaijan. And Andrey Kortunov joins us from Moscow. He is the Director General of Russian International Affairs Council. Completing our panel is Pieter Cleppe, the head of the Brussels office of Open Europe and the editor-in-chief of BrusselsReport.eu. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Andrey, let me begin with you. Over the past 3 months, there have been many diplomatic efforts to diffuse tensions in the region of eastern Ukraine. But I think it's fair to say most of them have largely failed. Now, President Putin and President Biden have agreed in principle to hold another summit to try to diffuse tensions. Tell me, what is Moscow trying to get out of this possible summit?
Well, I think that what drives Putin is his frustration with the performance of the Normandy group. Apparently, the Russian leader believes that the Western participants to the Normandy format, namely France and Germany, failed to incentivize the leadership of Ukraine to comply with the provisions of the Minsk agreements. And therefore, apparently, Putin believes that President Biden might play an active role in making the Minsk agreements work. Of course, the United States is not a formal participant to the Normandy process. The United States has not signed the Minsk agreements and has no responsibility for the implementation of the agreements. But I think that in the mindset of the Russian leader, President Biden still remains the person in charge, someone who can make things work, and someone who might be more responsible than other interlocutors that President Putin has so far dealt with.
Andrey, it's interesting what you say, because the Americans say President Putin is in charge. What happens in the region of eastern Ukraine would be decided by President Putin. And it's interesting to hear from a Russian saying that it depends on what President Biden does. Now, Matthew, let me come to you. Now, one of the biggest concerns for Moscow is the fact that the Minsk agreement has not been implemented. Now, in terms of this upcoming summit between President Biden and Putin, what do you think the U.S. can bring to the table in order to ensure that the Minsk agreement is implemented?
Nothing. Absolutely nothing. It's Russia that's in breach of the Minsk agreement. It has failed to remove its military forces from eastern Ukraine, as is one of its provisions. It's failed to disarm as well the illegal military forces in the east. I mean, in Donetsk and Luhansk, as Mr. Kortunov and you were just discussing, the United States is not in any way party to the Minsk agreements. The claim, of course, that the United States is the one that calls the shots, of course, it's not true. Ukraine is a sovereign country. And I think that the idea in Moscow is to try to sow tension between the U.S. on the one hand, and then France and Germany, which are the parties to the Minsk agreements, by making it look like maybe the U.S. is going behind the backs of both the Ukrainians and of the French and Germans. So there's nothing the U.S. can do on the Minsk agreement. Yes, Ukraine has not proceeded with finalizing its constitutional changes, but it has enacted laws that aimed, according to the Minsk format, to provide autonomy to the local leaders in Luhansk and Donetsk. But that's all part of a process in which the Russian side is in breach right now.
Now, Matthew, I assume one of the main goals for President Putin at this point is to ensure that the Minsk agreement is implemented. You say that it's highly unlikely. In fact, you say, no, it's not going to be implemented. The Russians should not expect anything from the Americans in terms of implementation of the Minsk agreement. So what is this summit going to achieve?
Yeah, dear Jafar, to be clear, I'm saying Russia is not in compliance with the Minsk agreement. So if it wants the Minsk agreement to be complied with by Ukraine, it has to show goodwill, and it has to move its forces away from the border, its border with Ukraine, because that's what the Minsk Accords call for. It call for all foreign military forces and mercenaries to be moved outside of Ukraine and away from the border. So what this meeting can do is, I don't know, it's not the U.S. idea. You know, this is Emmanuel Macron's idea. This is a typical French tactic, which is keep on talking, and don't focus on the details. So this happened back in 2008 in August during the Russia-Georgia war, when amazingly, it was then President Sarkozy who renegotiated the preliminary ceasefire agreement that his own foreign minister, Bernard Kouchner, together with the OSCE chairman in office, the Finnish foreign minister, Alexander Stubb, had brokered between Russia and Georgia. And Sarkozy went to Moscow and changed that agreement. And he agreed to a provision. This is mind-boggling. I couldn't believe it when I learned this, because I was one of the negotiators. Sarkozy agreed to a change in what had been agreed that would give Russia the right to patrol 5 kilometers beyond the location where their troops stopped fighting. And what that would have done would have given the Russian troops the right to block the main highway and railroad linking Tbilisi with the Black Sea. That's the main way that food and basic material comes to Tbilisi. When we asked the French side, did you have a map? Did you understand what you agreed?
Right.
They said, no, we didn't have a map. So I think this is what's happening again. Just talk for the sake of talking. But, you know, Biden is not an enthusiastic participant in this next round of talks, as far as I can see.
Okay. Peter, in Brussels, let me come to you. Do you think all the stakeholders, as Matthew says, are talking just for the sake of talking when it comes to diffusing tensions in the region of eastern Ukraine?
No, I don't think so. I think actually these are very serious talks, and not just for the gallery. But it's anyone's guess whether they will be successful. Now, I tend to be slightly more optimistic, and I'll tell you why. I think if you look at it from the perspective of Putin, then he has secured some success. Most notably, he has secured that Russian troops will be able to stay indefinitely in Belarus, which is very important because it means that the Russian border with Poland has been enlarged quite a bit. On top of that, of course, all this tension should lift the profile of Putin back home in Russia. You know, his popularity was before this thing escalated, was at the low level of 2013. Also, he has succeeded in destabilizing Ukraine. And I suspect he's now trying to get more concessions out of Ukraine regarding the situation in eastern Ukraine. Now, I think if he would escalate, if Putin would escalate now, I think it's pretty clear that the West would hit very, very hard. So the price would be very high. So I suspect that he may soon stop escalating. But of course, I may be dead wrong. But I think that's if you look at things from his perspective, I think that would be the rational thing to do.
Andrey, do you think by agreeing to hold this summit with President Biden in principle, by agreeing to hold this summit, President Putin has somehow indicated that Russia is now ready to de-escalate tensions?
Well, first of all, let me say that I agree that it seems that Putin is winning right now in the sense that he got the Western attention. We had a chain of high-level meetings, and the West is ready to offer at least some concessions to Moscow. Maybe not as many concessions as the Kremlin would like to get, but at least something, and something that would be probably inconceivable just half a year ago. So it is a success story, but the question is how to basically sell your stocks when the stocks are at their highest point. And I think it's not easy because definitely Putin wants more than Biden or anyone in the West is ready to offer him. And probably they believe in the Kremlin that in order to maintain this attention coming from the West, they need to preserve certain pressure on the West and certain tensions. I think it might be a slippery slope. And though I don't believe in a kind of direct, large-scale military operation that Russia might conduct in Ukraine. But I think that specifically in Donbass, escalation remains a very clear danger. And if it happens, it might produce a chain reaction that no one, including politicians in the Kremlin, do not really want.
Okay. Matthew, how likely is it for the clashes in Donbass to result in an all-out war between Ukraine and Russia?
Well, picking up on Mr. Kortunov's points, I mean, it depends on the extent to which President Putin feels he has won. And I very much agree with Mr. Kortunov that he has gained these big concessions in terms of having these requests for a new European security structure on the negotiating table, which would have been impossible a few months ago. So I hope that President Putin will decide now, okay, it is time to de-escalate and have serious talks and not escalate in Donetsk. But as of yesterday, I was really concerned that the situation in Donetsk seemed eerily similar to that in Georgia in August 2008, when separatists, namely South Ossetians, were firing artillery of increasingly large caliber at Georgian forces. The Georgians, just like the Ukrainians under fire from the Donetsk separatists now, withheld fire until they finally said, we can't fail to defend our own population anymore. We're going to return fire. And when the Georgians fired back, the Russian troops moved into Georgia through the Roki Tunnel. As of yesterday, that's what I thought President Putin's game plan was for Donetsk, in which case there would have been a war. Well, there is a war between Russia and Ukraine and eastern Ukraine, but that war would have escalated. Now, again, hopefully picking up on what Mr. Kortunov was saying, President Putin and Mr. Cleppe as well, now perhaps President Putin has decided, okay, it's time to have a serious negotiation. I've applied all the pressure I need to for now. And by the way, I can always turn that pressure back on because I'll still have those 30,000 troops in Belarus for a long time.
Okay, now I want to get the European perspective on the prospects of a war between Russia and Ukraine. Peter, can Europe as a continent, can EU afford a war in the region, considering it is still recovering from the effects of the coronavirus pandemic?
Unfortunately, Europe is strongly energy dependent on Russia, in particular Germany, because of its decision to shut down its nuclear energy, has become ever more dependent on Russian gas. Also, the sort of the climate policies, which have stressed, a lot of importance on renewable energy. Because renewable is so, let's say, untrustworthy, you need some kind of stable energy source to back this up. And this has also made Russian gas, or gas in general, very, very important. So, of course, if you would shut this off right now, it's clear that this would make European energy even more expensive than it is already today. So I think this is the main concern for Europe.
All right. Now, gentlemen, I want to move to the second part of our discussion today. And the second part is the expansion of NATO. Clearly, it is a concern for Russia. Andrey, before I come to you, I want to go to Matthew. Matthew, does NATO pose a threat to Russia?
No, of course not. Not in any military sense. NATO doesn't even have operational plans for attacking Russia. It's not within the mentality. It's not within anywhere in the structure of NATO. What NATO does do, though, or a successful Ukraine entering NATO, it provides a political threat to President Putin personally. No threat to Russia, but to President Putin personally, because, of course, a successful and democratic Ukraine, one in which a democratic government came to power by virtue of popular street protests and then enters NATO, is something that I think that President Putin is quite fearful of in terms of a potential precedent in Russia. So it's a question of President Putin threatening the deaths of tens of thousands of people because of his personal hold on power, which he wishes to preserve. But it's not a question of any NATO direct political or military threat to Russia. And in fact, keep in mind that NATO had zero military forces in the Baltic states or Poland, other than those states' own militaries, but no other NATO forces until Russia invaded Ukraine and annex Crimea. So there'll be more of that NATO presence, of course.
Matthew, if I may interject here, now
Ukraine
if the annexation of Crimea generated a wider presence of NATO in the region, then in some ways it does indicate that these two things are related.
Of course they are. It's defense. NATO, as you know, every member of NATO has a legal obligation under Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty to come to the defense of any member state that's threatened. 30,000 troops in Belarus, near Poland, and Lithuania, that's a threat. 130,000 or 150,000 Russian troops also in the area, that's a potential threat to these NATO member states. They're the ones who asked for a strengthened NATO military presence on their own territories. That is their sovereign right, and it is the obligation of the rest of NATO to respond to that request.
Andrey, I would like to get your response on this. How concerning is NATO's presence in the region for Russia?
Well, of course, if you go to the Kremlin, they would tell you that NATO is not really a defensive alliance, and they would refer to the NATO operations in places like the former Yugoslavia or in Afghanistan, or maybe NATO countries' operations in Libya. They would tell you that NATO is clearly something that Russia should be concerned about. And speaking of maneuvers, they would refer, for instance, to the maneuvers which are planned right now in northern Norway. It's about 35,000 people. The territory of the maneuvers covers the north of the country, and of course, many Russian strategists have no doubts that these maneuvers are aimed against Russia. So the perception of NATO remains that NATO is a hostile alliance, and that NATO regards Russia as an enemy. Therefore, the infrastructure of NATO, which is moving closer to Russian borders.
Andrey, if I may, by holding these drills, Russia is bringing, as you say, NATO, its hostile enemy, closer to its border, isn't it?
That's right. I think that it really depends on whether we are looking for a diplomatic solution or a military solution. If the decision is made that we can no longer rely on diplomacy, the military technical solution, as they put it in the Kremlin, is the only way to go. And unfortunately, we are moving in this direction. Okay,
Pieter, let me come to you. I just want to revisit the Minsk agreement before we end today's discussion. Now, Pieter, certainly everyone wants the Minsk agreement to be implemented, but the problem is Russia and Ukraine have their own interpretation. So is there a possibility for this agreement to be reworked?
Well, in theory there is, but as the former American ambassador has pointed out, Russia is already not implementing large parts of the current deal. So if you change the deal, then I mean, what guarantee do you have that Russia will actually implement that? I think Eastern Ukraine is way too attractive for the Kremlin to sort of poke some trouble, also to divert attention from domestic problems.
Okay, Matthew, this is going to be my last question for the show. Just very quickly, how likely do you think is for the Minsk agreement to be reworked so that all sides can finally implement it and that tensions in the region of eastern Ukraine are finally brought to an end?
I'm an optimist by heart. That's why I was a diplomat, but I'm pessimistic on this. I think the Minsk agreements now have become a red herring. Russia doesn't really care about their implementation, and that's why they're not implementing it. And Ukraine doesn't want to implement it in the way Russia wishes to, as you said. So I think the Minsk agreements are dead. They provide a topic of conversation, but there needs to be a decision by Moscow to de-escalate.
All right, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us today on The Newsmakers, and thanks for watching. You can follow us on Twitter @_Newsmakers, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Jafar Hasnan. See you next time.